Ethan was born into a house where silence spoke louder than love. In the grand estate of Tyrone, surrounded by green fields and gray skies, his life was shaped more by what was missing than what was present. As the younger of two sons, he had always stood in the shadow of his brother Idana, strong, charming boy who was everything their parents had hoped for. Ethan, in contrast, was quiet, bookish, and sensitive. He often preferred the company of music and words over people, which made his father frown and his mother sigh. They never said it aloud, but Ethan knew he was a disappointment. From a young age, Ethan learned not to expect affection. His birthday came and went like any other day. At dinner, his father spoke only to Aiden. When guests arrived, Ethan was kept out of sight unless he was needed to play the piano for their amusement. The estate was full of sound horses galloping, servants rushing, clocks ticking, but for Ethan, it was all noise. What he longed for was connection. Aiden was 6 years older and barely noticed him. But Ethan admired him deeply. He watched him from the hallway, memorizing his confident laugh, the way he moved, how people listened when he spoke. Aiden was not unkind, but he was distant, already promised to a life of importance that didn't include Ethan. When Aiden married and left the house, Ethan felt a strange emptiness settle inside him, like the walls had moved in closer. Their parents showed no signs of grief when Aiden moved to Dublin. Instead, they focused on the estate, the lineage, the expectations that Ethan was never meant to fulfill. He became a ghost in his own home, walking its long corridors with books pressed to his chest, retreating into imaginary worlds. Stories became his escape, language his rebellion. He began writing in secret pages, filled with thoughts he could never say aloud. Then, nearly a year after Aiden's wedding, a letter arrived. It was from Aiden's wife, written in a trembling hand. Aiden was gravely ill. They wished to return home, to rest in Tyrone, to be with family. It was the first time in months Ethan had heard his brother's name spoken with urgency. His heart stirred. Was this a chance to see him again, to say something he never could before? Their father made the preparations with quiet efficiency. "They'll arrive Tuesday evening," he said. Ethan waited with restless anticipation, sitting by the window long after the sun had gone down. As night settled over the house, the wind picked up, and Ethan felt a strange chill run through him. He didn't know it then, but this night would change everything. The sky outside was a deep, endless blue, slowly fading into black. Tuesday had arrived, just as their father had said, but the house felt suspended in a strange silence. Ethan sat by the window from early evening, eyes fixed on the long road that twisted toward the horizon. Each passing hour added weight to his chest. Where were they? Every shift in the wind, every rustle of trees made him sit upright, hopeful, but no carriage came, no lantern light moved through the darkness. The house remained still. His father, though calm in appearance, had begun pacing. Even he, a man not easily stirred, couldn't hide his discomfort as the hours crept past. Midnight came and went, and Ethan remained awake, listening for something, anything. Then, just after 1 in the morning, a sound echoed faintly across the land. It wasn't the rhythmic thump of hooves or the rolling of wheels. It was soft, distant, almost human, a cry, low and sorrowful, like a voice torn by wind. Ethan jumped to his feet and ran downstairs, calling for his father. "I heard something," he said, breathless. His father met him at the front door. The two stepped out into the cold night, eyes scanning the road. Nothing moved. The fields stretched endlessly under the moonlight, empty and silent. Then again the cry, this time more distinct but still far off, as though someone were lost in the fields, calling out. They stood in the night, frozen. Ethan's father whispered, "Did you hear that?" And Ethan nodded. "I did." They waited, expecting to see a shadow, a cart, someone approaching, but no one came. Eventually, they returned indoors, uneasy and wordless. A strange weight had entered the house, something unspoken settling in the air. The next morning, As frost covered the windows and silence continued to linger, a messenger arrived on horseback. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he passed the letter to Ethan's father. No words were needed. Ethan already knew. Aiden had died. He had passed in the early hours of Tuesday morning at precisely the time Ethan and his father had stood outside, listening to that mournful cry in the wind. Shock silenced the household. Ethan sat for hours in his room, unable to read, write, or think. He stared at his brother's portrait on the wall, remembering the way he laughed, the way the house had once felt alive with his presence. Now the echo of that cry haunted him, blurring the line between what was real and what was beyond explanation. He hadn't just lost a brother. He had lost a connection that had never been fully formed, a chance that would never return. And in that absence, a hollow space opened in him, one that would take years to name and even longer to understand. The years that followed Aiden's death moved slowly, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Ethan drifted through his days inside the stone walls of the Tyrone estate, a quiet figure whose presence was barely acknowledged. His father grew colder, buried in estate affairs, while his mother began to speak more often of family duty, legacy, and marriage, words that left Ethan numb. He had stopped writing. The stories in his head, once a refuge, now felt empty. Something in him had closed, and he no longer knew how to reach for the world outside himself. When Ethan turned 16, his mother announced they would travel to Dublin for the season. Her voice was sharp and determined. "You've been hidden away long enough," she said. "There are people in the city you need to meet. Real people." He didn't argue. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped Dublin might offer something. Nuif, not hope, then at least distraction. From the moment their carriage rolled into the capital, Ethan felt the air shift. Dublin was alive in a way Tyrone had never been. The streets pulsed with movement, flower sellers on corners, laughter spilling from cafes, music floating out of open windows. People met his eyes, spoke to him, even smiled without reason. For the first time in years, Ethan felt visible. His mother, ever strategic, introduced him to families of name and wealth. But Ethan was not interested in marriage, and certainly not in being paraded like a prize. What caught his attention was something else, entirely art, language, dance. He began spending evenings in theaters and galleries, sometimes alone, sometimes with students and poets who had no titles but spoke with passion and ease. He listened more than he spoke, but little by little, he began to talk. His words were clumsy at first, but they were his. One night, at a gathering in Marion Square, he met Lady Isabel Fallon. She was older than him by many years, but unlike others, she did not treat him like a child. Her voice was deep, thoughtful. Her stories carried weight tales of war, travel, betrayal, and beauty. They spoke for hours. Isabel listened to him the way no one ever had. And when she looked at him, it wasn't with expectation but curiosity. Weeks passed, and their meetings became frequent. Ethan felt steadier around her. He could ask questions, challenge her, laugh without shame. He did not love her, at least, not in the way he had read about in novels, but he respected her. He admired her mind, and more than that, he felt safe in her presence. For someone who had grown up in silence, this was no small thing. One quiet afternoon, Isabel proposed they marry. There was no grand declaration, no performance. She simply said, "We're good together, aren't we? I don't need romance, Ethan. I need companionship. You have a good soul." Ethan didn't answer right away. He wandered the city alone that evening, unsure of what to do with the offer. Was it wrong to say yes to a life that didn't thrill him, but offered warmth? Was safety a good enough reason to commit? He thought of Tyrone, of the cold halls and distant voices, and of Aiden's absence that still lingered like smoke. Then he thought of Dublin off evenings filled with conversation, books, light. The next morning, Ethan returned to Isabel's home, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Yes." It wasn't a choice made from passion, but from quiet certainty. And at that time in his life, certainty felt like the most precious thing of all. The journey to Killarney House took 3 days, but for Ethan, it felt like a crossing into another world. As the carriage rolled through the dense forest and winding hills of the countryside, the air began to change. It grew colder, quieter, older, somehow thick, with the kind of silence that doesn't simply lack sound but carries memory. When the house came into view, nestled between tall oaks and wrapped in morning mist, Ethan felt something stir within him. Not fear exactly, but reverence. The building stood proud and still, with stone walls stained by time and ivy creeping across its bones. It looked less like a home and more like a secret waiting to be told. Isabel leaned close and whispered, "You'll come to love it here. It's not a house that gives itself away easily, but it grows on you." Ethan didn't answer. He was too absorbed in the moment, the quiet river curving through the land, the worn statues in the garden, the way the clouds seemed to bend around the rooftop. This was not the noise and rush of Dublin. This was something deeper. Inside, the air was thick with wood smoke and the scent of old books. A kind-eyed woman named Maeve greeted them, her voice warm but careful. "Welcome to Killarney House, Mr. Ethan. It's a place of memory, this one. It remembers its people." Her words struck him oddly, but he smiled politely and followed her through the rooms. The walls were lined with portraits, each face watching in silence, eyes that seemed to follow his steps. But the rooms were beautiful wide windows, fireplaces crackling with life, and corners of comfort tucked into the grand design. That night, as Maeve showed Ethan to his room, something shifted. The hallway narrowed as they approached a large, dark, wooden door. Maeve paused. "This is yours," she said, opening it slowly. Ethan stepped inside, but something made him stop cold. Near the window, barely visible in the dim light, stood what looked like a long black coat hanging in the air, too rigid, too still. At first, he thought it was a trick of the eye, a shadow cast strangely by the fire, but when he blinked, it remained. He stepped back instinctively, his chest tightening. "There's something, I thought I saw something," he said. Maeve followed his gaze. Her face, usually so calm, went pale. "Was it a coat?" she asked, her voice low. Ethan nodded. Yes, it looked like a coat, but no one was wearing it. Maeve's hands trembled as she crossed herself. "Then you've seen it," she whispered. "The black cloak. That's what we call it. It only appears when something terrible is about to happen." Ethan stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or shiver. "It's just a coat," he tried to say, but his voice faltered. Maeve shook her head. "No, sir, it's never just a coat." They said little else that night. Ethan watched in silence, his mind echoing with the image of that floating darkness. When he finally lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. The wind howled softly through the trees outside, and the walls seemed to lean in closer, listening. He wanted to tell Isabel, but something held him back. The house felt like it belonged to her in a way he couldn't explain, as if it had chosen her long before he arrived. So he said nothing. Instead, he tried to convince himself that it was nothing more than fatigue and imagination. But deep inside, a quiet part of him knew. Something unseen had welcomed him into Killarney House that night, and it was not entirely glad he had come. In the weeks that followed, Ethan tried to build a routine at Killarney House. He walked the gardens in the morning, read in the sunlit drawing room by afternoon, and dined with Isabel each evening beneath a chandelier that flickered like starlight. From the outside, their life looked calm, even idyllic. But beneath that stillness, something had begun to change. Isabel was no longer the vibrant woman he had known in Dublin. She had become distant, distracted, as though her thoughts were always somewhere else. Sometimes she would vanish into the west wing of the house, the back corridors he had never seen, the ones she had asked him never to enter. Ethan tried not to ask questions. At first, he believed it was simply the strain of moving or the quiet heaviness of old memories. But soon, he noticed more. Doors that had been open were now locked. Mirrors in unused rooms were covered in cloth. Once, he caught the scent of perfume that wasn't Isabel's drifting through the hallway, followed by the sound of soft weeping. One afternoon, drawn by restlessness, Ethan stepped into the garden after lunch. The light was soft, the kind that blurs the edges of things, and the flowers swayed gently in the wind. As he turned a corner near the small back gate, he froze. There, sitting calmly on a stone bench, was a woman dressed entirely in black. She was turned slightly away from him, her face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Something about her presence unsettled him, not just her silence, but the way the birds seemed to have stopped singing the moment she appeared. Ethan approached slowly. "Madam?" he asked. "Can I help you?" The woman raised her head. Her eyes were pale, unnaturally so. White and empty. She was blind. "This is my garden," she said softly. "I'm sorry," Ethan replied. "I didn't know anyone else was here." She smiled faintly, but the curve of her lips held no kindness. "Tell Isabel I want to see her." Ethan paused. "Isabel? My wife?" The woman's face changed. Her smile twisted into something bitter. "Your wife?" she said. "Number, that's not right. I am Lady Fallon." Before Ethan could speak again, she rose from the bench with startling ease, walked past him, and disappeared down the path that led toward the back entrance. He stood there for a long time, uncertain whether to follow or to pretend he had imagined the whole encounter. That evening, he told Isabel what had happened. "There was a woman," he said carefully, watching her expression, "in the garden. She said her name is Lady Fallon." Isabel's face went white. Her fork slipped from her hand. "You must forget her," she whispered. "She does not exist." "But I spoke with her," Ethan insisted. "She knew your name. She—" Isabel stood from the table abruptly. "Do not go looking for her again. Please, for both our sakes." She left the room, her steps unsteady. Ethan remained seated, stunned by her reaction. The warmth that had once filled their conversations had vanished, replaced by tension that pressed down like a storm cloud. That night, he didn't sleep. He kept hearing the woman's voice in his mind, calm, assured, but broken by grief. "I am Lady Fallon." And for the first time since arriving, Ethan began to wonder, who had he really married? And what truths were buried in the west wing of Killarney House that no one dared speak aloud? The days that followed moved with a slow, aching weight, as if the house itself had sunk deeper into silence. Isabel withdrew almost completely, speaking only when necessary and avoiding Ethan's eyes. The warmth that had once lit her expression was gone, replaced by a weariness that seemed to pull at her shoulders. Ethan felt as though he were living with a stranger, someone wearing his wife's face but carrying secrets that had grown too heavy to bear. He tried to distract himself, walking farther into the grounds, sketching in his journal, playing the piano in the music room until dusk, but even music failed him now. The notes felt hollow, like a language he no longer understood, and every time he passed the west hallway, he felt its presence cold, waiting, watching. One evening, after a dinner shared in silence, Isabel suddenly rose and said, "We need to leave." Ethan looked up. "Leave where?" "Anywhere but here," she replied, her voice tight. "France, Spain, I don't care, just far from this place." She didn't wait for his answer. She left the room, her footsteps sharp against the stone floor. Ethan sat frozen, his hands clenched on the table. She had spoken with such urgency, such quiet desperation, that for a moment he felt breathless. Why now? Why the sudden panic? What had changed? The next morning, Ethan sought out Maeve. He found her in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she polished the silver. When she saw his face, The smile faded. "Maeve," he said, "please, I need to know the truth." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing, as though weighing something invisible. Then she nodded and motioned for him to sit. "What I'm about to say is not easy to hear," she began, "but this house doesn't keep its secrets well, not forever." Maeve told him about the other woman, the one who had called herself Lady Fallon. Her name was Margaret. She had once been Isabel's twin sister. "They were inseparable," Maeve said, her voice low. "But Margaret was troubled, brilliant but fragile. And when she married Lord Fallon, everything changed. The house changed. People started whispering." Ethan listened, his pulse quickening. "She disappeared one winter night. No one knew where she went. Some said she ran away. Others said Isabel hid her. But the worst whispers, though, said she died here. That something terrible happened in the West Wing." Ethan's chest tightened. "But I saw her, Maeve. She's not a ghost. She's real. She spoke to me." Maeve's hands trembled slightly. "Then she isn't done yet." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The house creaked and sighed around him like an old creature in pain. He closed his eyes but found no rest. Around midnight, the air shifted. A cold draft swept through the room, and then he felt it. A presence, heavy, breathing. When he opened his eyes, the woman in black was standing at the foot of his bed. She held a candle in one hand, in the other a knife. "Don't move," she whispered. "If you value your life, you'll listen." Ethan's body froze, every muscle tense, his heart hammering. "Did Isabel marry you?" she asked. "Yes," he said, barely able to speak. "We married in Dublin." She studied him, her milky eyes clouded but unblinking. "Then she lied," she said coldly, "because I am his wife. Not her, me." The candlelight flickered. Her voice dropped lower. "Leave this house tomorrow, or I will finish what she started." Then she turned, and without a sound slipped into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of her final warning and the gleam of the knife that had nearly touched his throat. When the first light of morning touched the edges of the curtains, Ethan was already dressed, his hands trembling as he folded his last shirt into a bag. The night had left its mark on him, not just in fear, but in clarity. The warning whispered in the darkness had pierced through the fog of uncertainty he'd carried since arriving. There was nothing left to question now. Killarney House was not a place of safety. It was a place of mourning, of madness, of stories that refused to die. He found Isabel sitting in the drawing room, still in her nightgown, her eyes red from sleeplessness. She didn't look surprised to see him packed and ready. "I saw her," he said. "Again." Isabel closed her eyes. "I know." Ethan waited for more, but there was only silence between them, long and heavy. "You should have told me everything," he said softly. "I was trying to protect you," she replied, her voice thin. "From her, from the truth, from what I did." "What did you do, Isabel?" She didn't answer, and Ethan didn't press her. He realized now that there were some truths that lived too deep for language. Some sins that echo not just in the memory of the living, but in the walls themselves. Without another word, he turned and walked out, the old wooden door closing behind him with a final sigh. The carriage that carried him away from Killarney House moved slowly down the gravel path, the trees on either side like watchmen. He looked back only once, and in the distance, he thought he saw Herth, the woman in the black coat standing by the garden gate, unmoving, waiting. Not for him, he knew, for the next. When Ethan returned to Tyrone, the landscape felt different, not because the land had changed, but because he had. The boy who had once wandered its halls in silence was gone. In his place stood a man who had seen what silence could hide, what stories could become when left untold. The house welcomed him with an unexpected warmth. His parents, though still distant, no longer seemed so unreachable. And in that small shift, something opened. He began teaching again, this time not just through books or language, but through storytelling. He invited young people from the village to gather beneath the trees and asked them to speak of their fears, their hopes, their strange dreams. He listened to them the way no one had listened to him. Slowly, his voice returned not as something borrowed, but as something earned. On some nights, the dreams still came. He would wake with the memory of the woman's face, her blind eyes burning through the dark. But he no longer ran from her. He sat with the memory, wrote it down, and turned it into a story. Not to forget her, but to name her, to make her known. Because some ghosts, Ethan had learned, only grow stronger in silence, and sometimes the only way to survive them is to speak. The story of Ethan is not just a tale of ghosts and silence, it's a mirror of how we confront fear, truth, and the voices we've been taught to hide. Through darkness, Ethan discovered that healing begins when we speak, when we listen, and when we dare to leave what no longer serves us. If this story moved you, inspired you, or helped you learn English in a deeper way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to bring you more powerful stories to grow with.